You're listening to the Valley Current.
So then by complete coincidence, which frames today's special podcast, because we're here on Monday, July 6th, after the 4th of July holiday, is I get a email, and the email is a copy with this course book of Being Human, Life Lessons from the Frontiers of Science. And it's by a client, or really a former client. I helped him with the case, Professor Robert Sapolsky, who's at Stanford, who you may know, Robert, because he's good friends with Dr. Bortz.
No, I know of him and some of his work, but I don't know him personally. And
what they do now at this company called the Teaching Company.
Yes, I'm aware of that company.
It's been around forever because they used to deliver stuff on audio tape and then on VHS tape and then on DVD, but now they deliver over the internet. So you can get things over the internet, and if you subscribe to their service, they now send you an email saying today is the anniversary of, and they sent me that email saying today is the anniversary of the discovery by Louis Pasteur on July 6th, 1885, of the vaccine for rabies.
Yes.
So that made me think, hey, we should do some little special few minutes about the rabies and the whole area of vaccinations. And what I sent you, but I don't know if you had time, but here's what Sapolsky looks like and what I did, because I couldn't get it to work on my computer. So I'm going to do something that's really, really awful here, and I'm going to be condemned for it. But I could not get it to play on my heavy-duty computer equipment here, but I could get it to play on my iPhone. So go figure why it couldn't work.
What is that, Sapolsky's book?
Yeah, no, this is Sapolsky's lecture in video. So let me just show you it. Let me just show you how this goes, and you can tell me if you could hear it, because I'll put it up there.
Manipulating in a way for the benefit of the parasite itself. But just because the organism is sick and its behavior changes, that's not what I'm talking about.
Yes, vaguely.
Cases where the parasite is able to selectively target a particular behavior of the mammalian host for its own benefit. And remarkably, one example of this has been known about for centuries. We all know this one, which is rabies virus. Rabies virus is, like all viruses, some form of parasite. What does rabies virus do? We all know it is finding a way to make as many copies of itself and pass them on. Now, there's lots of ways this could be done. Rabies virus could have evolved the means by which it gets into you and gets into your nasal passages, and what it causes you to do is sneeze dramatically and spritz the stuff all over the person sitting in front of you at a movie. It could give the infected organism this insatiable need to lick somebody else and pass on the rabies that way. What we all know is what rabies does is it makes you rabid. That's the way it is transmitted. It makes host organisms rabid, more aggressive, more likely to bite another individual, and copies of the virus, virions, copies are lurking around in the saliva there of the rabid animal and frothily get transferred to the next organism. Altering behavior. Think about this. You've got scientists who sit around, they squabble, they have childish fights, they try to block each other's students' doctoral theses, they get into it at conferences, all of it trying to understand the neuroscience of aggression, and rabies virus understands how to manipulate aggression better than all those scientists put together. But there's one vulnerability on the part of the rabies virus, though. And as we'll see shortly, another example bypasses it. What's the vulnerability? It's the non-specificity of what the rabies virus does, which is it makes a host rabid, which may then bite another organism where rabies doesn't have the means to manipulate behavior and get passed on. It may be transferred into a dead-end species. And that's a vulnerability for rabies, thank God. Rabbits, for example, may get rabies but not get rabid because it doesn't get passed on from there. That would be a dead end. Now we transition to the most amazing example of all of a parasite manipulating mammalian behavior
So the reason I put all that on is because what they did at the teaching company is they indexed all of their stuff, and then they generated a way to sort of say, hey, it's the anniversary date. So they tied it to another database, and they now send these emails out. And I thought his presentation was actually going to be about Pasteur and about the vaccine, but it wasn't. So I thought to myself, I really should probably get you on a podcast to talk about how much work it is to actually do a vaccine. Because in the days of Louis Pasteur, I think it was just like hit or miss experimentation, right? I don't think he did much in the way of actual science. Wasn't he just playing around with small samples? And he said, I'll give the rabies virus in a small dose to others and see what happens. I mean, it was sort of like dangerous experimentation, wasn't it?
Well, first of all, I need to correct an error made by Sapolsky.
Okay.
What I heard. He said that the virus could be spread through the nasal cavity, which is wrong. Rabies only spreads from blood to blood, which means through a break in the skin, by an animal bite, or other means, but it can only spread when introduced into the bloodstream of a mammal.
Right. So the bite has to actually break skin and get to blood.
Correct.
Okay.
I don't particularly care for the notion that the virus is aggressive. Viruses don't have brains. Whatever behavior the virus has is made by its victims, either singular or as a group. The present COVID-19 coronavirus has no brains. It doesn't move by having wings. It is spread, unlike rabies virus, but through aerosols or through the air and through the nasal cavity, unlike rabies.
Right. So the interesting part you should know is that particular show was, I think, 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, and their indexing tool, in other words, what we just saw, COVID-19 was not on the table. In today's version, which Sapolsky may correct to correct the error you just noted,
well, that's been known. What I stated has been known for decades.
Right. But your point of making the contrast about he's actually accurate about COVID-19. COVID-19 was not yet in existence, so far as we know, 5-6 years ago when he did the video. But what he said about the nasal passage would be true for that virus, whereas it's not true for rabies, right?
Right.
Right. And what you're saying is that what I'm, after you fix that error, which we just did, I'm just curious about, and I'm sort of surprised that it hasn't been fixed, because they could have edited that tape. I guess their name is the Great Courses now, whatever their name is these days. They could update their files, right? As people comment, sure. Like had you watched that and you wrote into them, they could fix that. But I'm kind of curious, do you think that Pasteur took some real risks in the way he did his experimentation? Because I'm not sure that the FDA would ever allow him to do. I mean, think about it, Len, because we're both laughing about this. There's no way the FDA would have allowed Louis Pasteur to do what he did back in the 1880s time frame, right?
Lord Edward Jenner, who was the first to vaccinate humans. Pasteur was not the first.
Right.
Pasteur was almost a century later.
So we're back in the 1880s with Pasteur. Some kid who's 9 years old has been bitten by a rabid dog, comes to Dr. Pasteur for a solution. I guess it's then July 5th or 6th. I'm guessing the 4th of July holiday must have been in the story somehow, right? Back in 1885, because the nation is about 100 and something years old at that point. It's probably celebrating, going on its 110th birthday in some ways. It's 20 years or so after slavery's been abolished, right? Think about the time frame, 1885, July 4th. There must have been a rabid dog, July 4th, July 5th. The kid gets bitten. They bring him to Dr. Pasteur. and Dr. Pasteur just figures out I'm going to put a low dose of this rabies vaccine that I'm creating?
That's not accurate. He allegedly thought that he had attenuated the virus by inactivating it. In other words, it was still capable of replication in a cell, but its pathogenicity was lost or gone.
Yeah, explain that so people who are not as advanced as you, including me.
There are several major vaccines. Rabies is a good example because the present rabies vaccines have been grown on my cell strain. And one of the great advantages of the cell strain WI38 that is used for the manufacture worldwide of the present human virus vaccine had the ability to attenuate the rabies virus, which means that investigators put the rabies virus in a culture of WI38 normal human cells in culture and laboratory glassware or plasticware, and keep passaging the virions produced in one bottle. Then they pass those virions to a second bottle as the virus destroys or replicates without destroying in some cases. Rabies is one case. But the cells continue to produce the viruses, and then they're passed on to another culture, the same kind of cells. And by repeating those passages, the virus becomes attenuated. It loses its capability for producing the virulent disease, but continues to replicate, so it retains its antigenicity, that is, its protein structures in most cases, that when used as a vaccine will have the vaccinee produce antibodies without getting sick.
Right.
And that's the basis of several major vaccines that are in use today, all produced on my cell strain WI38. Another great example is the rubella vaccine, used worldwide and produced on my human diploid cell strain WI38. In fact, the rabies vaccine produced in WI38 and used worldwide is mostly used in Far Eastern countries and several other underdeveloped countries where rabies is common and caused by dog bites. That rarely occurs in the United States, has not been a problem for decades. The number of rabies cases in the United States is only 1 or 2 per year. But the vaccine produced in WI38, where it became attenuated or lost its virulence, but maintained its ability to replicate, has been used worldwide and has saved the lives, or at least prevented the rabies disease, which is almost 100% fatal, in about 10 million people.
Right. It's a huge thing. And I'm glad I remembered correctly that you had told us somewhere in earlier discussions that WI38 acted to help both the rabies and the rubella. Yes. And I thought I remembered that when I saw that email, which is what triggered me sending you the email saying we should do this, obviously unscripted, obviously authentically in real time, because I thought you would have something to say about it. And I'm curious about this algorithm that you've just described as working, where you kind of go through this process of enabling the antibodies to sort of grow over time or become sort of more substantial. Do you see that as something that's going to play out in the C19 vaccine effort, or do you think something else will be the algorithm for success of a vaccine in the C19 arena?
No, well, that's being tried by several vaccine manufacturers currently who are growing the COVID-19 virus in cell populations, not WI38. They're using a human cell line developed from human embryonic kidney in some cases, in the hope that it will become attenuated by serial passage in those cells and retain their ability to replicate and induce antibodies in the vaccinees.
Right.
The other point about the rabies vaccine produced in my WI38 cell strain is that the number of injections required is about 3 or at most 4. Prior to that, the rabies vaccine was produced in neurological tissue, which is why Dr. Sapolsky perhaps knows something about it, since he's a neurobiologist.
Right, right.
And the vaccine produced in the neurons, I believe, of mice, I'm not too sure about that, but at least it was produced in the neurons derived from some animal, was required 8 or 10 or more inoculations over a long period of time.
13 by Pasteur, 13 or 14 on that kid.
Which elicited great pain in the recipient.
Right.
WI38 produced rabies vaccines do not produce a serious side effect and reduce the number of inoculations necessary to about 3 or 4.
Right. So why do you not think they're using WI38? It still exists, right? WI38 still exists as a platform, right?
Oh, yes, of course.
Why are they not using that for COVID-19? Or
I don't know the answer to that question. I tried to find out by going online and looking at obvious places, but I could not find out why. There are a couple of possible reasons. That is that influenza virus, for example, cannot be cultivated on WI38 or most other cell populations in culture. That's why it has to be replicated in embryonated eggs where it does replicate. So I don't know whether that's one of the reasons. Another reason that is also true for the HEK substrate produced experimental vaccines at the moment is that there is a group of people who refuses to have a vaccine administered to them if it was produced in cells from an aborted human embryo.
Oh, it's a religious thing. There's a religious thing, right?
Yes, as was the case with WI38 and these HEK cells, which may elicit the same response by that group of people. To say nothing of the larger group of anti-vaxxers, as they're called, who object to the use of vaccines generally, regardless of the substrate on which they're produced. And that can become a very serious problem in the future if we do develop a vaccine against COVID-19, because the necessity for herd immunity to occur will require at least 70% of the population to have received the COVID-19 vaccine. And that may not be achievable because the percentage of people who are against any vaccine will not permit the occurrence of herd immunity.
Oh, I thought where you were going with the 70% was the supply chain can't produce it fast enough.
No, I'm assuming they can.
It's a big problem itself. The supply chain is a big problem itself because we don't manufacture things here anymore.
It's not the production of a vaccine to inoculate the world's population. That is not the problem usually. For example, when I produced the first polio vaccine in WI38, you get titers, which means, let's say, for simple argument, that if the laboratory vaccine produced 1 million virus particles and it took only 1,000 virus particles to produce immunity, then you could dilute the vaccine from its content originally of 1 million particles to 100 or 1,000. And thereby increase the number of doses logarithmically, so that I easily produced in my laboratory at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia enough polio vaccine to vaccinate half the world's population by that means, because the number of virus particles produced was actually 1 billion virus particles per milliliter.
Okay.
And if I could produce liters in my laboratory. So if you do the math, it's not difficult to understand how one laboratory can produce billions of doses of a vaccine whose limited smaller numbers elicit a good antibody, a neutralizing antibody response.
But when you did the research and try to find the platform that they are using, do you think they're keeping that secret because there's a competitive thing going on between these big pharma companies on this vaccine?
No, I don't think so, because I know where I established the bank where WI-38 ampules are currently stored, and the management of that bank is obligated to alert me to individuals who want to have those cells as a source for vaccine manufacture. And I have not been contacted by the managers of that bank.
And that's in the United States, right?
It's in the United States.
Okay, so they're not using it, but would you suggest they should use it?
Well, it's obvious to me that they must have tried. WI-38 is also available from other sources, but not at the low passage levels required to produce vaccines, except where I just described my bank is located. But you can do experiments in order to determine whether that WI-38 will be useful for COVID vaccine production by obtaining the cells from many other sources where the cell population is at such a high population doubling level that it can be used for research purposes, but not for vaccine production.
Okay, so do you think that if it was disqualified, it was disqualified on these sort of ethical/religious grounds, or do you think it just didn't produce the same results as other platforms? What I'm calling a platform.
Yeah, I think both things are possible. The vaccine manufacturers, if they found a cell population that wasn't derived from a spontaneous or surgical human abortion, and that they could replicate the virus on a cell population that was not derived from that source, then they would opt probably to use that other source if the virus replication was high enough to make it logistically capable of producing enough vaccine to make it economically profitable.
Right, but wouldn't everything that you've learned over the last 50, 60, 70 years suggest that using a human tissue platform would lead to better results than using an animal platform? Or do you think they're both the same depending on the circumstances?
Well, that's not necessarily true, but the logic would dictate that a human cell source would be better than an animal cell source because the virus is clearly growing and replicating very well in human cells, and
right.
not very well, if at all, in animal cells. So
right.
that would be the logic. However, this HEK cell population is not a normal human cell strain. It is an abnormal cell line with cancer cell properties that has been artificially made in a laboratory to be an immortal cancer cell-like population. That was a serious problem 50 years ago when I was in this part of biology, and even the switch from growing the polio vaccine in the times of Sabin and Salk in primary monkey kidney cells, which primary means the cells are taken from tissue extirpated from an animal, in that case a monkey, grown in culture and never passage from culture vessel to culture vessel. The fear was that if you did that, the cells would obtain cancer cell-like properties. I won't go into the technical details why, but that was the belief.
Okay.
And when my cells became obvious to me that they could make a perfect substrate for the production of human virus vaccines, I was criticized because my cells were passaged. They were passed from vessel to vessel in order to increase their numbers logarithmically for the production of adequate quantities of vaccine. There was absolutely no evidence that my cells, even to this day, when passaged in hundreds of laboratories worldwide, have never obtained or developed the properties of a cancer cell. But that was ingrained in the minds of the gray eminences of that day in the 1960s, that they fought the use of my cells for production of human virus vaccines for at least 15 or 20 years, during which time people who worked with monkeys to produce the cells for poliovirus vaccines, in some cases, there were deaths resulting from unknown viruses present in monkey kidneys.
Right.
And not only deaths, but people became unable to function. And many viruses were found to be present in the monkey kidney cells at that time. My cells were completely clean. No one has ever found an unwanted virus or an unknown virus in my cell strain WI38.
So do you think they're taking a huge risk with this what do you call it, HEK?
HEK.
Yeah.
No, they're not, because of an event that occurred when the biotechnology industry became established. Without knowing the history that I just explained and the danger that the majority of the leadership in biology held at that time, without knowing this history, Genentech, the first company to produce a biological DNA technology, produced their clot-busting, common terminology used, clot-busting product on cells that were not primary, like my human diploid cell strains, but were produced on the type of cell like HEK, which in this specific case were Chinese hamster ovary cells that had cancer cell properties. By the time they contacted me as a consultant, and I learned that they were producing this very important clot-dissolving product on these cancer-like CHO cells, it was then known to me and to others in the biological community that there were ways of eliminating any, even to the molecular level, molecules from the cell substrate, in that case, Chinese hamster ovary cancer cells, in the final product produced in those cells. So with that knowledge that you could eliminate any semblance, any molecule from the cell population in which the product was produced, I organized a conference in Arlington, Virginia, in order to get the world's community of then emerging vaccine producers, not only vaccine producers, but also recombinant DNA product producers, and there were many then whose names will be familiar even to this day, who I invited to this conference in Arlington, Virginia, so as to be as close to the FDA as possible, in order for them not to have an excuse not to come to my conference, and because all they would need would be a subway fare.
Right.
People attended this conference from all over the world, including Cuba, Russia and every country who had manufacturing capabilities in the recombinant DNA field. And it was that conference where I had a document produced to be signed by the leaders in the conference as a whole. To have that document signed by the leaders in the field worldwide, not expressing their unconcern for products produced in cancer cells as they are still produced today in this Chinese hamster ovary cell line, because techniques existed to eliminate entirely from the final product any molecule associated with those cancer cells. And that may opened up the opportunity for those cells to be used worldwide, as they have been ever since that time in the early 70s, I think it was. To this day, HEK cells are used for the production of biologics.
So you got the document signed then. You accomplished your mission.
I did, yes.
Well, that's great. Congratulations. Did the FDA come to the meeting?
They did.
Okay.
And then in typical fashion, the FDA did what it always does when it learns that outside of the FDA itself, academicians have made a revolutionary decision. They themselves organized their own conference, inviting many of the people that I had already invited a year earlier to the conference I just described, so that they could claim that they also decided to accept these abnormal cancer-like cells for the production of biologicals on their own terms. And that was typical political behavior on the part of the FDA.
That's called being a fast follower. That's what people do all the time, Len. That's how companies succeed in Silicon Valley. The pioneers get shot with arrows in their back, and the fast followers win.
That's exactly, your terminology is exactly what dozens of people have said about me, that it's the pioneers who have the arrows in their backs. And I can assure you, and you know very well what I'm about to say.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Arrows in my back.
Yes, I do. That whole description has not been fully podcasted yet, but I'm building to that point. I hope you appreciate. It may take
I would like to address it, and I would look forward to it as much as you will.
Okay, so let's wrap up in a minute or so. So today is the birthday of the rabies vaccine by famous Nobel Prize winner, right? Didn't Pasteur get the Nobel Prize, or did the Nobel Prize even exist back then?
It did. I don't believe it existed.
He would have gotten it for sure, right? He probably would have gotten it for sure.
Not necessarily. Jonas Salk did not, nor did Albert Sabin. The person who got the Nobel Prize in respect to the polio vaccines that those two scientists developed was John Enders and his associates Weller and Robbins, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering that the poliovirus could be replicated in the same kind of cells that I worked with later. That is, normal human diploid cells that they derive from circumcised tissue.
Okay.
And they won the Nobel Prize because they overthrew the dictum laid down for 10 years by Albert Sabin, who held up the field, in my judgment and the judgment of many others, held up the field of polio vaccine research for a decade because of his belief that the polio virus could only replicate in neurons.
Right.
And consequently, people did not look at any other cell population for the purpose of making a vaccine until Enders, Weller, and Robbins did it. So they won the Nobel Prize, not Sabin or Salk.
So the pioneers not only get shot in the back, they never are recognized for the Nobel Prize either, when they should be. So let's wrap up on that thought, which is we are now at the 135th birthday of that vaccine being discovered by that particular scientist, really medical doctor, right? More of a medical doctor than a scientist,
by
right?
Pasteur, yes.
And so some of that learning and some of what's in this podcast hopefully will transmit itself and inspire others to keep finding vaccines based on the kinds of experiments that people do. But I keep wondering, and this is my punchline, the FDA probably would have limited Pasteur and would say, no, you can't do that. And maybe that would not have even been discovered for another 100 years because he probably put that kid at risk, right?
Just as important, if not more important, is the way that the smallpox vaccine is made. I don't know whether it is still made this way, but for decades it was made by hanging a sheep by its legs, shaving off the fur on its back, inoculating the animal, or I should say a cow, not a sheep, a cow, inoculating the smallpox vaccine into its hide and allowing the pustules that formed to be opened and dripped into a pan below the hanging animal.
Wow.
And then harvested and made into the smallpox vaccine. And that's the way it was made for decades. That's the way it was made by Jenner. So we used to have a laugh about how that was done, and then looked at the regulations that the FDA had for other vaccines. It was laughable. Not only that, when you think about the polio vaccine, or even more importantly, I guess, the Sabin vaccine, which is administered orally, the Sabin vaccine, which is now used worldwide except in the United States, where it was decided not to use the Sabin vaccine for a reason I won't go into now, but rather to use the attenuated, the killed Salk vaccine.
The FDA imposes these regulations, and in many ways, I think they retard science, but I think they're now going to realize COVID-19 requires them to relax because we're losing people daily, and the faster we get to a vaccine, the better off we're going to be as a world, not only as a country, but as a globe, as a world, right? The entire world needs this vaccine, right?
When you say relaxing, I don't know what the definition of that would be, but I can tell you that when Salk vaccine was being produced by one manufacturer here in California, in fact, called Cutter Labs,
right?
When they first produced the vaccine, it suffered a problem, I won't go into the technical details now, in which there was live hot polio virus left in the Salk vaccine that had many vaccinees, mostly children, come out with hot polio and suffer the consequences because of the speed with which this company wanted to produce the vaccine.
Right, so it has risks.
So the risk of a coronavirus, live coronavirus, being administered to vaccinees is also a possibility.
Right.
It's probable, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility
right.
when you do something rapidly without fully understanding the system.
Right. So you gotta make the balance work out in a smart way, and maybe we can, maybe we can't. But thanks for spending your afternoon on very short notice with me, and we'll pick up the conversation next week or maybe this Friday, because I've got other topics I want to send to you, because I think we're only still in phase 1, and I don't know what phase 2 of this virus is going to do to us, but I fear it may be many times worse. And if we don't have a vaccine, we're really going to be in trouble.
Well, I don't think we're going to be in too much trouble, because the people who are getting this virus are, for the most part, those people who will get sick, not vote, and therefore solve the problem that way.
I like this. You're saying politics ties right into biology and the way in which the evolution of man happens.
In this case, it could be the case that the victims of the coronavirus who have become victims because of their stupidity will be unable to vote, and therefore the pandemic will end.
Well, I think biology wins out over politics, so I think you're right. Thanks for spending your afternoon with me, Dr. Leonard Hayflick. We really appreciate your time this afternoon. See you later. You take care. Bye-bye.
Tune in next time on the Valley Current.